You're listening to DNA ID, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime, Zodiac Speaking,
Beyond Bizarre True Crime,
Citizen Detective, and
Campus Killings.
All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
It was 1985. 13-year-old Autumn Anchor knew that she would be in trouble. It was 2:30 a.m. on Sunday, July 7th, and she was out far, far later than she was allowed to be. Autumn and her mom, Jane Hylton, were staying at the El Dorado Hills, California home of a friend of Jane's, a woman named Maureen Kay. Maureen was out of town on a camping trip through the weekend, but she had given Jane and Autumn permission to stay at her house for the time being. Also staying at the house were Maureen's 20-year-old son, Ricky Davis, and his 19-year-old girlfriend, Connie Dahl. Arriving at the house, located at 2848 Stanford Lane, Autumn sat on the front stoop, working up the courage to go inside and face her mom's wrath. She feared her mom was probably still up waiting for her, as there were some lights on inside the house, as well as the outside porch light. Autumn sat there for close to an hour, until around 3:30 in the morning, when Ricky and Connie came home after going to a party. The three decided to go inside together, hoping that if Autumn were with the others, her mom would be less likely to ream her out. They walked in the front door and tiptoed upstairs where the bedrooms were located. Ricky and Connie escorted Autumn to the spare bedroom she was using. They said goodnight and walked out. Connie later said, quote, "We were trying to be quiet because Autumn was worried that her mom would be mad that she was coming in so late." There was no sign of Jane, Autumn's mom, but walking in the upstairs hallway, Ricky saw a substance that looked like blood puddled on the carpet outside the master bedroom door, which was closed. This was odd because that was Ricky's mom, Maureen's room. She was out of town. No one was supposed to be using that room. Ricky turned on the hallway lights and saw blood on the walls and doorframe. Tentatively opening the door and peering into the bedroom, Ricky flipped on the light and saw Jane lying in the bed. The room was covered with a horrific amount of blood. Ricky later said he didn't really notice the blood as much as the blood-covered woman supine on the bed. He felt for a pulse, and there was none. Meanwhile, getting a glimpse of the carnage in the bedroom, Connie screamed. Autumn came out of her bedroom and unfortunately saw the scene in the master bedroom. Connie then ran downstairs and called the police. El Dorado County Sheriff's Deputy Terry Booman arrived at 3:39 a.m. and observed the woman, identified by Ricky, Connie, and Autumn as Jane Hylton, lying on her right back on the bed. She wore a dark silk nightgown with a floral pattern that was bloodied and punctured. She was cool to the touch, her eyes fixed and dilated. She had no pulse. Spattered blood was noted on the floor, walls, bed, and furniture. The night table was crooked. A bloodied lamp with a broken light bulb was on the floor next to the bed in front of the nightstand. The dented and bloody lampshade was on the floor several feet away, and the smashed light bulb shards were scattered on the floor. There were blood spatters from the floor to the ceiling in the area of the door to the bedroom and all around the bed. A bloody hand smear was on the bedroom wall, and both the bed and box spring were saturated with blood. Initial observations were that Jane had been attacked in the upstairs hallway outside the master bedroom. She had struggled with her attacker, the confrontation spilled into the master bedroom, and Jane was stabbed multiple times and ended up dead on the bed. The sheriff's deputy acting as coroner, Deputy Gradall, arrived at the scene at approximately 4:30 a.m. He went to the master bedroom and observed Jane for himself. Her eyes were wide open. Numerous stab wounds were evident. He noted that the body was in rigor, meaning to him that she'd been dead for several hours. Sergeant Larry Hennick of the El Dorado Sheriff's Office then taped the entire scene, including Jane's body on the bed. Her body was removed, and the crime scene techs got to work. EDSO employees collected, among other things, one fingernail found on the bedroom floor at the right side of the door, which appeared to be from Jane's left middle finger. 6 hairs from Jane's left hand and 7 hairs from her right hand. A broken necklace from the floor, and 2 cigarette butts from an ashtray. The cigarettes were not the brand that Jane or any of the other residents in the house smoked. Blood was also collected from various other areas of the home, including from the hallway outside the master bedroom, a carpet in the living room, and an upstairs bathroom where watery bloodstains marred the sink and toilet. A faded, old-looking smear of blood was also collected from the front doorbell button. Things they did not initially collect pointed to a somewhat hurried crime scene investigation. These were a bloody sheet, a hand towel, and 2 washcloths found by Connie Dahl in the laundry hamper the day after the murder. Let's talk about who Jane was. Jane Meriwether McMeekin Hylton was born in Alberta, Canada on July 20th, 1930. When she was killed, she was days away from her 55th birthday. A week after her death, her close friend Pat Franklin wrote about her in a column for the Folsom Telegraph. Pat described Jane as flamboyant and opinionated, but also incredibly generous, giving, and energetic. She worked as an interior designer and a realtor. She was active in her church, she played bridge, she sold art at a local gallery, and she loved to knit. A redhead, Jane loved fashion and was the announcer for local fashion shows. She grew up in a military family and had lived all over the world. Jane had been married 3 times, first to Stuart Purvis, second to John Anker, and finally to Archie Miller Hylton, whom she had married in 1984. She had 6 children. She had lived in El Dorado Hills for 9 years and was a columnist for the Foothills Times, a newspaper that circulated in El Dorado County for much of that time. Her column, The Village Fair, covered local events and town news. Jane and Archie had been married only a year, but in the summer of 1985 they were having marital issues. The couple lived in Diamond Springs with Jane's teenage daughter, Autumn. Autumn had gone on a trip to Disney with a friend, and while she was gone, Jane had left Archie a note saying she needed a break. On Friday, July 5th, she had taken some of her stuff and crashed in El Dorado Hills with her friend Maureen Kay. Jane was also friends with Maureen's mother, Wilma, a local realtor who was Jane's employer. Maureen and her boyfriend left for a camping trip on Saturday, leaving Jane and Autumn to stay in her house, along with Maureen's nearly adult son, Ricky Davis, and his live-in girlfriend, Connie Dahl. The El Dorado Hills neighborhood was a desirable, upper-middle-class neighborhood in a peaceful community with little violent crime. It's a bit of a cliche, but neighbors said they didn't lock their doors. Jane's murder was an absolute shock to residents. A week after the murder, neighbors implemented a neighborhood watch program to try to recapture the feeling of security they had once enjoyed. Forensic pathologist Dr. Robert Anthony conducted the autopsy on Jane on July 8th. Dr. Anthony counted 29 stab wounds on Jane's head, chest, back, and arms. She still had the broken tip of a knife in her skull. The stab wounds, 3 of which would have been fatal on their own, penetrated both her front and back, puncturing her lungs. She had a cut to her jugular vein and defensive wounds on her hands and arms, including a totally missing fingernail that was found on the floor. She had bruising on her cheeks, eye, nose, upper lip, and jaw, and a large chunk of flesh was missing from under her chin. And she had a bite mark on her back upper left shoulder. The official cause of death was exsanguination secondary to multiple stab wounds. Dr. Anthony did not include a time of death in his original autopsy report. He also did not include anywhere in his report that Jane had been moved after she was killed or that the crime scene had been staged in any way, both things that would later be alleged. Jane's blood-saturated nightgown was retained in evidence and fingernail scrapings were collected. A rape kit was done, but there was no evidence that Jane had been raped. The missing piece of flesh from her chin was recovered from the floor of one of the other bedrooms in the house. Okay, let's get to the witness interviews that would be crucially important in this case. After receiving a call from dispatch, El Dorado County Sheriff's Detective Bill Wilson arrived at the crime scene at approximately 4:15 a.m. He and Sergeant Larry Hennick conducted the initial interviews of Autumn, Ricky, and Connie. Wilson noted right away that Ricky's hair seemed out of place. Ricky confirmed that he and his girlfriend Connie lived in his mom Maureen's house, that Maureen was away for the weekend, and that Jane Hylton and her daughter Autumn were house guests. Ricky told Wilson and Hennick that on Saturday night, he and Connie left the house around 10:30 to go to a party. When they left, Jane, whom Ricky described as a really nice lady, was the only one in the house. She was lying down on the couch. The couple returned home around 3:30 in the morning, finding Autumn sitting outside, and they all came inside together. Ricky related how he had come to find Jane's body. Quote, "I turned on the hall light, and that's when I seen all the blood. I seen Jane lying there, and it was completely dark. I walked back in the room, and I turned on the light, and that's when I seen Jane." End quote. Ricky said he asked, Jane, are you all right? Oh my God, she's been murdered. He said he, quote, felt her pulse for about just a couple of seconds, and then I just dropped it and got out of there. Ricky said he ran and grabbed a butcher knife because he was so freaked out. He said, quote, "Alls I wanted was to see a cop, with a gun." Ricky had a history of law enforcement contact, and he admitted in this interview that it was the first time in his life that he was glad when law enforcement showed up. Ricky said he and Connie had been together the entire evening. He also said he thought his mom's friend Jane was really nice. She'd only been staying there for 24 hours, but she was a nice person, he said. He had zero idea who could have killed her. Ricky was visibly shaken up and upset, the detectives noted. The detectives next spoke to Connie, and she told them the same story. She and Ricky went to a party, they got home and found Autumn, they went inside, and Ricky found Jane. In response to their questioning, Connie said that Ricky and Jane got along great, and Ricky was a mellow person whom it took a lot to piss off. Then they interviewed 13-year-old Autumn, who had just lost her mother in the most horrific manner. She was pretty much hysterical. She said when she saw her mom's dead body on the bed, quote, "I lost my mind. I started freaking out and crying. I fell on the floor, screaming." Autumn felt particularly bad because she had lied to her mom that night. She had pretended to call a friend to make a plan to go to the movies. But instead, she left the house at approximately 9:30 p.m. to meet up with 3 older teenage boys. Autumn said she was remorseful that she hadn't stayed home that night. Her mom's marriage was breaking up, and she was upset about it. Autumn later said, quote, "I feel guilty that I didn't stay there that night and listen to my mom. She needed a friend. She wanted to talk to me, and I didn't want to hear it. I lied to her." Autumn said she and the older boys went to a party and went to a local park, sat on the tennis courts, and drank and smoked pot. All of the teens, Autumn, Connie, and Ricky, denied having anything to do with Jane's murder. But within a day, Ricky was arrested and hauled down to jail. Not because the deputies had evidence that he had killed Jane, but because in the course of searching the house and property, they had discovered 7 cultivated marijuana plants growing in the backyard. This contributed to one of the theories the police were considering, whether the murder was the result of a home invasion by people seeking drugs. But no other drugs or paraphernalia were found, and there was no evidence that any had ever been there. Further, nothing appeared to have been stolen, which seemed unlikely if marauding druggies were the culprits. A neighborhood canvass by El Dorado deputies revealed that the neighbors had not seen or heard anything out of the ordinary, even though the next-door neighbor said her window was open all night and it faced the bedroom in which Jane had died. There had been a party at a home on Stanford Lane that night, so many strange cars were parked on the street, which sort of complicated the investigation. The police noted there was no evidence of forced entry to the home, but would Jane have locked the doors with her young teen daughter out in the night? It seemed unlikely. Indeed, a sliding glass door to the kitchen was open and the garage was open. Whoever had killed Jane had probably walked right in. Ricky, Connie, and Autumn were all interviewed again over the next weeks and months. Autumn's story in particular was deemed to have inconsistencies with her initial statement, which was given by a 13-year-old on the night her mother had been slaughtered. The story she told in her second and third interviews was that she had had a fight with her mother that Saturday evening because she wanted to go to a party with Connie and Ricky, and Jane said no. Autumn was too young to be going to nighttime parties with way older teens. Autumn had left the house and gone to a nearby park where she met 3 teenage boys. They invited her to hang out and party with them. Autumn went back to her house, showered and changed, and pretended she got a phone call from her friend inviting her to the movies. She left the house and actually met up with the 3 older boys. Autumn admitted she didn't even know the last names of 2 of the boys. One she knew was named Kelvin. She had spent some time alone with him. This was Kelvin Beckham. The second was named either Brian or Stephen. She couldn't recall which. Later, we will hear that his name was Stephen G. The third boy was the only non-white teen in the trio, a black teen named Michael Green. Autumn recalled that Michael Green was from Roseville. In another follow-up interview in the summer of 1986, Autumn retold the same story, but this time she added that it occurred to her that maybe, while she was alone with Kelvin, Michael Green and Stephen G. went back and killed her mom. She said she felt that Michael Green was angry with her for some reason, that if either of those teens had killed Jane, it would have to have been the, quote, black guy if it were those two who killed my mom, end quote. Finally, Autumn told the detectives that Michael Green was wearing camouflage clothing and carrying a knife that night. Autumn later said the detectives were accusatory of her from the beginning. They accused her of having a hand in the slaying of her own mother, she said. Much later in her victim's impact statement at trial, she said, quote, "The police were constantly interrogating me. I was not being heard. Being accused and held responsible for mother's death forced me to be defensive to both the police and my family. No one believed me." The 1985 detectives made a half-hearted effort at finding the 3 teenage boys Autumn claimed to have been with that night. They had Autumn look through some high school yearbooks, but gave up when they couldn't figure out exactly who they were. And that lead was never followed up on again. The detectives also asked Connie and Ricky for a list of people at the party they attended that night. The two said that many people at the party had seen them and could vouch for their being there, and they handed over a list of names. According to court documents filed decades later, Detectives Wilson and Hennick did not investigate or interview a single one of those partygoers during the initial investigation. Police first turned to a potential suspect whose relationship to Jane made him a person of interest, her husband Archie. In Autumn's initial interview, Autumn told the police that over the 4th of July holiday, Jane and Archie had argued over finances and family cars. She said her mother told her that the arguments with Archie had become physical in the past. Autumn told the police that her mother was afraid of Archie and that Autumn believed Archie was capable of doing such a thing to her mother. Connie Dahl told police that Jane told her she had left Archie for good and wanted a divorce. Right after hearing this, deputies went to Archie Hylton's home and arrested him as he was leaving his house. They told him he was under arrest on suspicion of murder, and he said, "Who am I supposed to have killed?" This is apparently how he learned that his wife had been killed. Archie was brought down to the station and questioned. He told the investigators that his marriage to Jane was just fine, no problems. He said the last time he talked to Jane was on the morning of July 5th, when she said she was going to stay with friends. When they asked him for an alibi, Archie said he was at a Denny's restaurant on the night of July 6th, during the time frame in which police believed Jane was killed. Archie gave blood and hair samples but was released, and the charges dropped. El Dorado Sheriff's Lieutenant Howard Wilson acknowledged that they had questioned him but said he, quote, was not a prime suspect. So Archie was let go, his arrest having been a tad premature. But the reality was the investigators had set their sights on someone else. Lieutenant Howard Wilson said that while they did not have a specific suspect, they did not believe the crime was random. But detectives Larry Hennick and Bill Wilson told reporters for the Placerville Mountain Democrat that they were sure Ricky did it. This despite the fact that Ricky's car hood was still warm when the detectives arrived at the house, and Autumn said she saw Connie and Ricky drive up and they all entered the house together. Ricky was not publicly named as the prime suspect at this time, but behind the scenes, the cops were focused on him. And it seems they thought it was a conspiracy and Autumn and Connie were in on it. But they couldn't prove it. Ricky Davis passed a polygraph exam on January 6, 1986. It was determined that he truthfully answered that he neither stabbed Jane nor saw anyone else stab her. However, the polygrapher concluded that Ricky did have some information about the murder that he was holding back. Autumn, meanwhile, failed her polygraph, but no one believed that the small 13-year-old had stabbed her mother 29 times by herself. Connie, Ricky, and Autumn stuck to their stories that they were not involved. The murder weapon was never found, nor was any bloody clothing Ricky might have been wearing if he'd killed Jane. None of Ricky's fingerprints were found in the bedroom where Jane died. The police just didn't have anything on them, other than gut feelings and a few inconsistencies. The case stalled. Placerville Crime Stoppers offered a $1,000 reward for information, but nothing led to any breaks in the case. There was no progress on the case until November 1999. That's 14 years after Jane Hylton was slain in a bloodbath in Maureen Kay's master bedroom. That month, El Dorado Sheriff's Detectives Rick Fitzgerald and Richard Strasser began reinvestigating what had become a cold case. Now, I'm going to say up front here that I don't know and therefore cannot make a statement one way or the other whether the ensuing actions of Detectives Fitzgerald and Strasser were designed to frame Ricky Davis or whether they legitimately got tunnel vision on him the way Detectives Wilson and Hennick appear to have in the 1980s, and that therefore they failed to pursue other investigative avenues. An entire civil lawsuit is currently pending in federal court over that very issue. In reviewing the old case files, crime scene video, interview transcripts, and media coverage of the Hylton murder, the detectives fixated on statements made by Ricky, Connie, and Autumn that they felt just didn't mesh with the crime scene evidence. Here are some things that gave them pause. As reported in a Placerville Mountain Democrat article from July 1985, 2 days after the murder, Connie Dahl gave journalist Pat Lakey a tour of the house. Lakey was able to observe for herself the blood-spattered walls and stained mattress. Lakey reported in her article that Connie told her, quote, Jane was lying in bed like someone placed her there in the position she would normally sleep in, end quote. But the detectives reading this old article noted that actually Jane's knees were up in a manner that would not comport with sleeping, and it looked to Detective Fitzgerald as though the vast majority of the blood was on the floor rather than the bed. They began to fixate on the idea that Jane had died on the carpet and the crime scene had been staged. They focused on the words spoken by Connie, someone placed her there. Detective Fitzgerald also listened to audio of Ricky's original interviews and somehow concluded that Ricky had said Jane was lying on the floor when they found her. To him, this wasn't just a confused young man who misspoke. It meant they had lied. That meant they were hiding something, and that meant they had killed Jane. The detectives later asserted in court documents that all three of the teens had made reference to Jane being moved from the floor to the bed. The detectives also noted that on the night of the murder, when he spoke with detectives at the scene, Ricky's affect had not seemed appropriate. He later admitted to, quote, clowning a deputy who had tripped and fallen while toting a shotgun into the house. Ricky laughed that it reminded him of Barney Fife. It struck some of the investigators as a bit callous and odd, given the circumstances. The 1999 investigators decided to conduct another round of interviews. Detectives Fitzgerald and Strasser traveled to Eugene, Oregon, to re-interview Connie Dahl. At first, she told them the same story she and Ricky told the first time. They found Jane and had no idea who killed her. By the end of the 3-hour interview, Connie admitted that Ricky had killed Jane. She said that Jane and Autumn had argued about Autumn going out. Ricky intervened and offered to give Autumn a ride, and the argument escalated. Ricky punched Jane and then stabbed her. According to the National Registry of Exonerations, quote, Dahl said that she acted as a lookout and that Autumn looked on as Davis stabbed Hylton to death. Dahl and Autumn then moved Hylton's body from the floor to the bed, and all three left to buy alcohol and cigarettes and went to a local pond to practice the story they would tell police, end quote. They then returned to the house, and that is when they called the cops. Now, the matter at issue in the civil lawsuit I mentioned is exactly how Connie got from point A, which was she and Ricky had nothing to do with Jane's murder, to point B, Ricky did it and she and Autumn were accessories. In 4 subsequent interviews, conducted over the course of 18 months from November 1999 to February 2001, Connie's story evolved further and included details such as she was the one who bit Jane on the shoulder, that she had seen Ricky with a knife, that she and Autumn watched the murder, that they all showered and put on fresh clothes because they were sprayed in blood, and that Ricky had planned the whole thing. Connie also claimed to have been using meth and drinking on the night of the killing and said that she hadn't slept in days. It has to be said that the interview transcripts reflect that the detectives clearly manipulated Connie, both threatening her and cajoling her, and convincing her that Ricky had programmed her, that she had amnesia, and that they had DNA and other evidence of her participation in the crime. They strongly implied that she might get to keep her kids if she cooperated. Despite the fact that Connie was unable to answer questions about the murder weapon or what the trio had done with their bloody clothes, she confessed to being the one to bite Jane and helping Ricky move the body. Further, and crucially important, is the fact that Connie knew nothing about the bite mark on Jane's shoulder until the detectives told her about it. They basically said, "Have you ever bitten anyone?" And she said, "Maybe once or twice." And they said, "Jane was bitten," and she said, "I don't think I did that." They eventually wore her down to the point that she said she was the one who did the biting. The detectives re-interviewed Autumn and told her they believed Connie and Ricky had killed Jane. Detective Fitzgerald told her that he knew she didn't kill her mom, but he said, "Let's send Ricky down the river. Tell us the truth." Autumn stuck to her original story that the three of them entered the house together and she saw her mom dead on the bed after hearing Connie scream. Then in December 1999, they went to interview Ricky. Ricky was in federal prison, serving a 12-year sentence for 2 bank robberies he'd committed in Sacramento County. On August 13, 1996, Ricky had walked into a Bank of the West in Citrus Heights, California, and passed the teller a note saying, "This is a robbery. No alarms or cameras. Give me the money." He made off with $2,966. 2 days later, he hit a First Interstate Bank in Fair Oaks, scoring $728. He tried to rob a Bank of America a few days later, but failed. Because bank robbery is never a good plan, Ricky was caught, tried, and convicted after he pleaded guilty. Anyway, Detectives Strasser and Fitzgerald visited Ricky in the pen. Detective Strasser brought up the Hylton murder and asked Ricky who he thought had done it. Ricky said he always thought Autumn might have had something to do with it, but he recognized she was too small and weak to have carried it out by herself. Even though the detectives tried to deceive Ricky and told him Connie and Autumn had ratted him out and DNA tests were being conducted to prove his guilt, Ricky stuck to his guns. He continued vehemently to deny killing Jane and said Connie was lying. He told the detectives, quote, "You clowns can go back to El Dorado County. This conversation is over." The detectives forged ahead. They wrote up warrants for the arrest of Connie and Ricky. The statement of probable cause claimed that blood on the top of Autumn's shoe meant she was present during the murder. Blood found on the doorbell belonged to Ricky Davis, indicating he had cut himself during the crime. Connie Dahl knew information that only the killer or someone present would know, that Jane was stabbed on the floor and then positioned on the bed in a sign of remorse by someone who knew her. And Connie had remorsefully confessed, describing in detail how Ricky and Jane got into a fight. Ricky told her to act as a lookout outside the front door, and she could hear them fighting, and Jane crying in pain and gasping for breath, pleading with Ricky to stop, and then gurgling noises. When Ricky finally called her upstairs, Jane was dead on the floor. You'll note that no mention was made of the hairs found in Jane's dead hands at the scene. I'll tell you up front that the hairs were lost after they were sent to the California Department of Justice. Gone. If those hairs had been available, I suspect the case against Ricky Davis would never have gone to trial. But go to trial it did, despite the best efforts of Ricky's lawyer. Connie and Ricky were both extradited to El Dorado County in January 2002 and charged with murder. Both pleaded not guilty. Ricky's lawyer filed a motion to dismiss based on the grounds that so much time had elapsed, witness memories were compromised, and therefore Ricky could not get a fair trial. To prove his point in the motion to dismiss hearing, Ricky's defense attorney called 3 alibi witnesses who had originally been named by Ricky as people who could vouch that he was at the party he said he attended that evening. But now in 2002, none of them could recall that specific evening, and they were unable to confirm or deny that Ricky was present. On May 21, 2002, the El Dorado County District Attorney's Office filed a criminal complaint for premeditated murder against Connie and Ricky. Autumn was not charged because she was a minor at the time of the slaying. El Dorado Deputy District Attorney Jim Wagoner told Autumn in a meeting with her attorney, quote, "I want to prosecute the person responsible, which I believe to be Ricky. I want to successfully prosecute him on this." Detectives Strasser and Fitzgerald had told Connie in their third meeting with her that if she cooperated fully, she would be punished lightly. They were going after Ricky. On April 10, 2003, Connie met with Detectives Fitzgerald and Strasser for a 5th time. Also present were El Dorado Deputy District Attorney Colin Anderson and Connie's attorney Mark Ralphs. DDA Anderson explained to Connie that in exchange for her testimony against Ricky, she could plead to the lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter and receive a potential sentence of 3 to 11 years in state prison. Connie agreed to this. She pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter that same day. The case was going to trial, and Connie was the star witness against Ricky Davis. In connection with the trial prep, Detective Fitzgerald tracked down a man named Michael Green, who had resided in El Dorado Hills as a teenager. Remember, the notes from Autumn's original interview contained a statement she made that one of the teenage boys she'd been hanging out with on the night of the murder was Michael Green. Well, now, when interviewed about the murder, this Michael Green said he did not know anyone named Autumn Anchor personally. He did know her as a friend of a friend. He denied knowing anyone named Kelvin. He'd never been to the park Autumn claimed to have been hanging out at on the night of the murder, and he denied ever being with Kelvin, Autumn, or anyone else at the park that night. And, by the way, he was white and not from Roseville. They never looked for a black man named Michael Green from Roseville like Autumn had described. They chalked it up to Autumn was mistaken at best or lying at worst. Ricky's trial started on July 12, 2005, 20 years after Jane Hylton's murder. At the trial, the jury was shown an hour-long video of the crime scene and the body. Ricky had an outburst, crying out, "You'll have me convicted already." The prosecution's case relied almost exclusively on testimony from Connie Dahl. The state depicted Ricky as having a quick temper and a short fuse. They said he had exploded at Jane over a minor incident, which was the disagreement about whether Autumn could go to the party with him and Connie. They put Connie on the stand, and she said Jane told Ricky, "I don't want her riding with you, you scumbag." And that's what set him off. She said Jane ran into the bedroom to get away from Ricky, and she heard her scream. She told the whole story about Ricky fighting with Jane gurgling, and then going silent. She ran in and saw Jane stabbed to death. "I was screaming, 'What are you doing? You're killing her.' It was horrifying. He must have got her in an artery. Blood was everywhere," she said. She said after Jane was dead, she and Ricky moved Jane by picking her up by the arms and legs and moving her onto the bed. She also said Ricky programmed her to tell the story that they came home and found the body. Connie also testified to Ricky's temperament. She said he was violent and physically abusive to her. She said she originally lied to cover for him because she was afraid of him. She also admitted she had done meth on the day of the murder. The defense got Connie to admit that Detectives Strasser and Fitzgerald pressured her to give up Ricky, saying things to her like, "The first one to jump on the bandwagon always gets the easiest ride," and implying she would get a lighter sentence if she cooperated, and saying, "You've got your babies, what are you going to teach those kids?" implying that her kids would be taken away if she did the wrong thing here. She also admitted under cross-examination that during every one of these interrogations, she'd been under the influence of meth. But the prosecution's case was persuasive. The prosecution introduced an incident in which Ricky fought with a neighbor over his dog straying onto the neighbor's property. The neighbor, who happened to be an agent with the California State Bureau of Narcotics Enforcement, testified that he told Ricky to keep the dog off his property. Ricky shouted that he would kill the man and his wife and daughter and attempted to attack him with a steel bar. The neighbor had a gun, so the incident ended, but the prosecution used it to show that Ricky was prone to violent rages. Another neighbor testified that she saw Ricky dragging his girlfriend into the house by the hair. It wasn't a good look for Ricky. The prosecution, for some reason, was able to relate to the jury that Ricky had felony convictions for bank robbery, grand theft, drug dealing, grand theft auto, and gun possession. The defense introduced several women who testified to Ricky's gentle nature, but they couldn't deny Ricky's record. And one of the original patrolmen who responded to the scene testified that Ricky had come across as giddy that day. He said Ricky was acting as though he'd just gotten off an amusement park ride. It was unusual, he said. And it didn't help that Ricky was portrayed as resentful of and adversarial toward the investigators. Detective Strasser testified that during his preliminary hearing testimony, Ricky had mouthed to him, "You're a fucking liar." When Ricky's attorney objected, Ricky shouted out, "You're right, I did say he's a fucking liar." Detective Anthony, the medical examiner who had conducted Jane's autopsy, testified that Jane's body had been moved from the floor to the bed after her death. This conclusion was not in his original report. The doctor told the jury that he came to believe Jane was moved after the detectives showed him the crime scene photographs in October 1999. He said if she had died in that bed, her knees would have been lying flat rather than with her knees up. This supported Connie's story that the body had been moved and bolstered the theory that the ones who, quote, found Jane were the ones who killed her. You'll recall Dr. Anthony had not included an estimated time of death in his report either. While on the stand, he now posited that the murder happened between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m., which meant that Ricky Davis had no alibi. The defense called several people to testify who had attended the party that was Ricky's alibi back in 1985, but the prosecution was able to cast doubt on their accounts with the new timeline in air quotes, and it didn't help Ricky's case. The prosecution called FBI forensic examiner Alan Gusti, who testified that he performed DNA analysis on evidence collected from the scene. He determined that DNA from 2 small drops of blood adjacent to the doorbell and a blood smear collected from the front doorstep of the house was consistent with Ricky's DNA. The prosecution's implication was that Ricky had likely cut himself while stabbing Jane. To counter the DNA evidence, the defense hired attorney and DNA expert Robert Blazier, who had worked for the defense in the O.J. Simpson case. Blazier went after Gusti, who initially excluded Ricky as being the contributor to the DNA found on the doorbell. Gusti said that in his first report, dated January 2001, quote, "I made a mistake." Blazier got Gusti to admit that there was no way to tell how old this blood was, and since Ricky had grown up in that house, it would be expected that his DNA might be there. What had he done? Rung the doorbell to his own unlocked home after he killed Jane upstairs? Autumn, now a grown woman, testified about the night of the murder. She told the same story she told detectives, that she came home around 2:30, she waited outside for Ricky and Connie, and they all went in the house together and found Jane. She denied having anything to do with her mother's murder. Further, she said of Ricky, quote, "I did not see him do anything to my mom." She said she had no idea whether Ricky had killed Jane, and she wasn't in the house when her mom was killed. Quote, "I could not state who was in the house when my mom was killed. I definitely was not." But the prosecution asked Autumn to tell the jury what she told detectives in 1985 about a dream she had about her mother's murder, in which her mom was killed on the floor and moved to the bed. Prosecutors presented a psychologist who told the jury this was a common way for witnesses to deal with trauma. They recall it in a dream to distance themselves from the situation while still recalling it. It meant that Autumn had witnessed the murder, although she claimed not to remember it consciously. A defense expert refuted this, saying that Autumn's dream was just one of many she had after the death of her mother, all with different scenarios. But the dream was damning to Ricky's case, since it mirrored the story Connie Dahl was telling. And then Ricky himself took the stand, and he didn't do himself any favors. He denied having anything to do with the murder, but he came across as confrontational and contemptuous of the prosecutor, according to the Placerville Mountain Democrat reporter in the courtroom. On cross-examination by prosecutor Colin Anderson, Ricky dropped multiple F-bombs and called the lead detective, Rick Fitzgerald, a creep, saying he hated him. He told the jury, quote, "I will laugh when he dies." Ricky admitted to threatening to blow up the dog feud neighbor's house and calling his wife a whore, making a list of people he hated, threatening people who crossed him, and so on. None of it had anything whatsoever to do with the evidence against him, which was nil, but it did not make the jury view him sympathetically. He also admitted to his multiple felony convictions, but called himself, quote, "a thief with integrity." Ricky addressed the jury directly, calling them "you guys," and calling Connie Dahl a, quote, "crazy lady and a delusional, evil, ugly, fat bitch." Closing arguments were what you would expect. The prosecutor, Mr. Anderson, spent 2 hours painting Ricky as a control freak with rage issues who slayed Jane because she stood up to him. The defense painted the chief witness against Ricky, Connie Dahl, as an unreliable meth head who was testifying to save her own skin. Defense attorney Jim Clark pointed out that the bloody clothes and murder weapon were never found, and there was no concrete evidence against Ricky. The 8-woman, 4-man jury deliberated for 2 days. On the third day, they informed Judge Eddie Keller that they were deadlocked at 11-1. They did not indicate which way they were leaning, but everyone knew. The female holdout juror was very upset in the courtroom, and one of Jane's daughters, Sue Ann Schrader, was in tears, the stress getting to everyone. Judge Keller told the jury to take a break for the afternoon, and the next day, August 17, 2005, they found Ricky guilty of second-degree murder. Jane's family hugged Detectives Strasser and Fitzgerald. Ricky later said he felt catatonic at hearing the verdict. An unnamed male juror told the Placerville Mountain Democrat that Ricky's testimony about threatening to blow up his neighbors' homes, wielding a steel bar at a neighbor who was in law enforcement, and wishing Detective Strasser dead, quote, was frightening. People went home that night and could not sleep. If he gets out, the carnage would never end, said this juror. Another juror cited the obscenities Ricky used on the stand when discussing the investigators who were just doing their job. He said the incident where Ricky threatened the neighbor's family was also decisive, because it showed he had a hair-trigger temper. They also came to the conclusion that Autumn had managed to suppress the memory of being present during her mother's murder. But the jurors said the most significant aspect to the jury was Connie Dahl's testimony. It was detailed and meshed perfectly with the time frame and manner the pathologist had established for Jane's murder. The jurors concluded, quote, "There's no way anybody else could have done this." Oh, really? At the sentencing hearing in September, Jane's daughter Sue Ann Schroeder gave a victim's impact statement in court, relating how her mother's murder made her live in fear that the rest of her family would be killed. Quote, "It is almost impossible for me to describe to the court how my mother's death has impacted my life. What can I ever say to the court that would really make you understand the sadness in my soul, which will miss my mother for the rest of my life? Throughout this trial, Ricky Davis has shown no remorse for murdering my mother, which only emphasizes to me that he believes he can get away with murder." Ricky interrupted, shouting, quote, "This lady wants to judge me." After being warned and continuing to make outbursts, he was picked up in his entire chair and removed from the courtroom for the remainder of Sue Ann's statement. Autumn spoke next, referring to the night of the murder as a, quote, "dreadful nightmare. For 2 decades I have carried the burden of these people's actions. After my mother's death, all happiness was lost. We were ripped from our nurturer, confidant, and friend. The glue that held our family together was gone." She thanked the jury and judge and prosecutor, quote, "for bringing justice to my mother's death and finally giving her soul a chance for peace." Remember, Autumn left the house on the night of the murder around 9:30. Ricky and Connie were still home at that time. In her mind, it was possible that they had indeed killed Jane. When it came time for sentencing, Judge Keller said, quote, "Ricky Davis should never see the light of day. He cooked up an alibi and staged the scene. This poor woman," referring to Jane, "was here for the weekend and it winds up ending her life." Ricky wasn't in the courtroom to hear the judge's words. He had been banished to his side room for continued disrespectful behavior. Ricky was sentenced to 15 years to life with a 1-year enhancement for the use of a lethal weapon. After his sentencing, Ricky was sent away to complete his federal prison term for bank robbery before commencing his sentence in El Dorado. Connie Dahl, meanwhile, was sentenced to 1 year in the county jail. But with time-served credits, she never spent a day there. Judge Keller ordered her into a substance abuse program and chastised her for not coming forward with what she knew earlier. He said, quote, "You were barely 18 and addicted to meth and alcohol. You were a young, immature woman who was in way over her head. You didn't know Ricky Davis was going to act that way. Who could have?" He ultimately thanked her for doing the right thing and said the community owed her a debt of gratitude. Quote, "You accepted your responsibility and accountability, and I sincerely believe that without you and your testimony, we wouldn't have known where the blame really rests for this horrible crime." Detectives Strasser and Fitzgerald won a prestigious California Law Enforcement Investigative Excellence Award for their role in resolving the Hylton case. But it wasn't resolved at all. For the next decade, Ricky did whatever he could do to appeal his case. He exercised his right to a direct appeal of his conviction, his attorney arguing that the trial court had wrongfully permitted the introduction of impermissible character evidence, the neighbor and dog story, and had denied him the ability to present alternative perpetrator evidence, that Archie Hylton could have done it. In November 2007, the California Court of Appeal for the 3rd District upheld Ricky's conviction. After that, representing himself, Ricky filed petitions for a writ of habeas corpus in 2009 and 2010. Both were denied. According to the Innocence Project, starting in 2006, Ricky wrote hundreds of letters to the Northern California Innocence Project at Santa Clara University Law School. They commenced an extensive review of the case file, court record, interview, and trial transcripts. In 2010, they officially began representing Ricky. The Innocence Project contacted El Dorado District Attorney Vern Pearson in 2014. After reading through the transcripts of Connie Dahl's series of interviews with El Dorado detectives, D.A. Pearson agreed that the methods used to elicit her confession were problematic. Pursuant to a request from the Innocence Project, he agreed to permit testing of Jane Hylton's nightgown. It had never been tested, and because the nightgown was saturated in Jane's blood, DNA testing on the bite mark area of the nightgown was deemed impossible in the early 2000s when the case against Ricky was going to trial. Now, with DNA analysis having advanced significantly, the Innocence Project lawyers had pointed out that there might be DNA on the nightgown where Jane had been bitten, and it was time to find out. The Innocence Project and Pearson arranged for the Sacramento County District Attorney's Laboratory of Forensic Sciences to analyze the nightgown and other evidence. Angel Shaw, a DNA criminalist in the biology section of the crime lab, was instructed to try to find the bite mark area on the nightgown and swab it for DNA. She opened the evidence envelope containing the dried-out, blood-soaked nightgown which had been sitting there for years. As she described it, she found it to be crusty and moldy. It also had been cut on the top to remove it from Jane's body, and there was no tag, so the front and back were indistinguishable. Ms. Shaw had to use crime scene photos of Jane in the nightgown to figure out which was the back and which was the front. She found the area of the nightgown that corresponded to the bite mark on Jane's left rear shoulder, and she took swabs of the approximate shoulder location on the nightgown, seeking saliva enzymes. Testing revealed the presence of biological material, nucleated epithelial cells, and low levels of the enzyme amylase, both indicative of the presence of saliva. DNA testing on this sample revealed the single-source profile of an unknown male, not Connie Dahl, who claimed to have bitten Jane, and not Ricky Davis, who was in prison for killing Jane. The male DNA profile was also not consistent with the DNA of Jane's now-deceased husband, Archie Hylton. It didn't match the DNA of anyone at the scene, as first responders had since been tested. The DNA belonged to an unknown male who had contact with Jane on the night she died. And there was more. Criminalist Shaw examined the fingernails clipped from Jane's right hand at her autopsy and the broken one the CSIs found on the bedroom floor. She observed reddish-brown matter that yielded 3 alleles consistent with the DNA on the bite mark area of the nightgown, not Ricky. Analyst Shaw uploaded the DNA profile to CODIS, but there were no hits. Surprisingly, whoever had perpetrated this brazen, seemingly motiveless attack on Jane was not in the system. Given the new DNA evidence, in October of 2016, the Northern California Innocence Project filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus on Ricky's behalf. The court agreed to hear the case and held an evidentiary hearing as to the new evidence presented by the Innocence Project. Connie Dahl had died of a meth overdose in March of 2014, so she could not be questioned about the inconsistencies in her statement that she had been the one who bit Jane, and the DNA evidence to the contrary. According to the Innocence Project, at the hearing, DNA analyst Shaw testified for nearly an entire day about the new DNA profile she had discovered on the nightgown and under the fingernails. And a report by Dr. Richard Leo, a false confessions expert, had concluded that the detectives' interrogations of Connie Dahl were, quote, designed to pressure and persuade Dahl to adopt an account that matched the detectives' pre-existing beliefs about how and why the murder of Jane Hylton occurred, end quote. He gave his expert opinion that the interrogations of Connie were psychologically suggestive, manipulative, deceptive, and coercive. Because of a recent change in California law, Ricky's lawyers just had to prove that all this new evidence would likely have been compelling to a jury. According to court documents, after the hearing, Judge Kenneth Malikian took 10 months to review everything: the trial transcripts, the lab reports, witness statements, case file materials. On April 15, 2019, he reversed Ricky's conviction and ordered a new trial that would include the new DNA evidence. The El Dorado County District Attorney announced his intention to retry Ricky Davis. But behind the scenes, the DA's office had started to doubt the wisdom of proceeding with a second trial against Ricky. The new trial was repeatedly delayed by the illness of Ricky's defense attorney and some other factors. It was finally scheduled for early spring 2020. But before then, there was stunning news. On the morning of February 13, 2020, El Dorado County District Attorney Vern Pearson filed a motion to dismiss all charges against Ricky Davis and requested a finding of factual innocence. The motion stated that the DNA evidence on the nightgown and under Jane's fingernails proved that Connie Dahl's testimony at Ricky's trial was false. At a hearing later that day, Judge Malikian granted the district attorney's request, vacating Ricky's conviction and dismissing the case. "You're factually innocent," the judge declared. Ricky was sent back to county jail to be processed and released that very same day. What was going on? Well, with 2 weeks before the judge ordered a new trial for Ricky, District Attorney Pearson had requisitioned a forensic genealogy analysis of the bite mark and fingernail unknown male DNA profile. The process took months and months, and the DA's office forged ahead toward trial while it was going on. But as it came time to set a date for trial, there was a breakthrough in the genealogy investigation. It confirmed that the source of the DNA wasn't Ricky Davis, but someone else entirely. The man who left his DNA on Jane Hylton was arrested on February 11, 2020. Investigators from the DA's office worked to verify that this man had in no way collaborated with Ricky Green. He hadn't. They didn't even know each other. Ricky was innocent. 2 days after the arrest, at a February 13th press conference, District Attorney Pearson announced that when his office was faced with the DNA evidence that was inconsistent with both Connie and Ricky, they started to approach the investigation as they would a first-time prosecution. A new team of cold case homicide investigators started a review of the case and saw more and more problems with the conviction. When the lab failed to get a hit in CODIS to the unknown DNA, and they had ruled out everyone whose DNA had been tested in the case, his office arranged for the Sacramento DA's crime lab to use forensic genealogy to identify a new suspect and exonerate Ricky. Pearson stated bluntly, quote, "I can tell you with all confidence he," referring to Ricky Davis, "did not commit this crime. He is not responsible for it. I'm not telling you we can't prove it. I'm telling you he didn't do it." Pearson credited the Innocence Project for bringing the DNA issue to his attention. The Innocence Project lawyer for Ricky, Melissa O'Connell, had had no idea that forensic genealogy was being used until she got a call from Pearson telling her he was dropping the charges against her client and someone else had been arrested. Pearson said, quote, "Justice has been served, but it took too long, and some awful mistakes were made in the past to get to this moment. I have personally apologized to Ricky Davis and also want to say we are sorry to Jane Hylton's family for the mistakes in handling this case in the past," end quote. In a subsequent interview with USA Today, Pearson said the developments are, quote, "two of the most dramatic extremes you can experience. On the one hand, we have the system working in the worst possible way. On the other hand, we have the evolution of technology in terms of genetic genealogy. It's a surreal thing in a sense. Note that back in Ricky's 1985 interview session with Sergeant Larry Hennick, the sergeant said to Ricky that the murder, quote, may be a whodunit, somebody we don't know, somebody who happened by. Well, they should have gone with that. Ricky walked out of jail amidst a cheering throng of family members and Innocence Project staff and went straight to a pizza dinner. He didn't make a statement at that time, but he waved around an Innocence Project shirt, calling them angels. He later talked to CBS News, saying, quote, I've forgotten more things than I even remember. I miss this beautiful country. I miss the trees. I miss everything. I miss fresh air. You know, you can never make up for it. I realize that you just pick up the pieces and move forward and make the best of what's left, end quote. District Attorney Pearson met with Ricky in the county jail before he was released and issued an apology on behalf of his office for what Ricky had gone through. Quote, I had to tell him in all candor, when this investigation had moved forward years ago, the technology did not exist. The techniques did not exist that were employed in this case to unwind it in the way we were able to do now. I wish it had occurred sooner, that we could have gotten him out of custody sooner. The practical reality is it's only been the past year and a half, 2 years, that genetic genealogy to identify someone in these circumstances has been in existence, end quote. Pearson said Ricky was very emotional, crying. He'd been saying since 1985 he didn't do it, but no one believed him. Well, speaking of forensic genealogy, Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert's office facilitated the analysis, the first time a forensic genealogy analysis had been conducted in a post-conviction case in California. A private lab prepared the SNP profile, and the Sacramento County District Attorney's investigators, assisted by El Dorado DA investigator Joe Ramsey and crime analyst Sandra Rivas, performed the analysis. I was told by Ms. Schubert that the forensic genealogy information is confidential and would remain so. So, unfortunately, I have no details to share with you. I do know that the analysis was far from straightforward, took hundreds of hours, and that the DNA relatives located in GenMatch were fairly distant cousins, requiring lots of tree building, finding most recent common ancestors, and descendancy work. Monica Zedkowski, an investigative assistant at the Sacramento County DA's office who worked on the genealogy, said that she felt an additional sense of urgency because they knew Ricky was awaiting post-conviction relief. They knew that if they came up with a different name, it might exonerate Ricky and lift a cloud of suspicion on Autumn as well. It did both. At the press conference, Ms. Schubert addressed the media, saying, quote, when crime scene evidence is uploaded to a genealogy site, law enforcement does not get access to individuals' genetic information. They get the same information that anyone using the site would get, a list of potential relatives that may lead them to the answer. Investigative genealogy, just like DNA, is about one thing, finding the truth no matter what it is. The victim and her daughter deserve that. Ricky Davis deserves that. Without IGG, we would not be here today. She continued, this is the first case in California where genetic genealogy has not only led to the freeing of an individual from prison for a crime he did not commit, but the identification of the true source and the arrest of the individual who did it, end quote. Who were they talking about? Who did it? Well, the genealogy pointed to Michael Eric Green, born on May 8, 1968, to parents Earl Henry Green Jr. and his wife Ange Green. This Michael Green had to be dead, you're thinking. No way would he allow Ricky Davis to serve a decade and a half in prison for a murder he didn't commit, right? Wrong. He would and did. Michael Green was alive and well and living in Roseville, California. He'd been married and had kids. He was now living with his mother in the same town he'd grown up in. Investigators needed an STR profile for Michael Green to compare to the DNA profile and evidence. They set up a trash pull at the house where he lived with his mother, and at which he appeared to be the only male resident. His father had died in 2016. They surreptitiously collected the trash, tested it, and compared the male DNA profile found on the garbage to the DNA profile on the nightgown and fingernails. The results showed that Michael Green was the source of the DNA found on Jane Hylton. Green was arrested on February 11, 2020, without incident, outside his home, across from Maydew Park in Roseville. District Attorney's investigator John Gaines was present for the arrest. Here's what he later testified happened. Quote, this conversation took place in the driveway near his vehicle, near the hood area of his vehicle. I told him that we were assigned to reinvestigate a homicide because the subject that was convicted had appealed that, and his name had come up in the original investigation. We asked if he would go with us to the Roseville PD because it was easier to speak without the traffic noise and spreading things out on the hood of his vehicle to use as a table. He declined that, but said he would be willing to talk with us there, end quote. Gaines and his partner Joe Ramsey asked Green whether he had heard of the murder of Jane Hylton. He said no. He denied knowing anyone named Autumn. He denied having ever heard of Ricky Davis. He denied ever having been on Stanford Lane in El Dorado Hills and claimed he did not recognize the house when shown photos. He did not remember ever biting anyone. He had no explanation for how his DNA could have been found inside the house. Then Green was taken into custody, cuffed, and taken to the Roseville police station. A search warrant for his DNA was executed and a buccal swab collected. It confirmed what they already knew. The chances were 1 in 9 trillion that the DNA on the nightgown came from someone other than Michael Green. The DA's office started putting together their case against Michael Green. When they had received his name from the genealogy team in Sacramento, there were practically audible gasps among the DA's office personnel. Michael Green's name was in the case file. In fact, he'd been mentioned several times, but no one back then had cared to listen. Michael Green had been the black teenager from Roseville Autumn had told investigators she hung out with on the night of the murder, along with Stephen G. and Kelvin B. She had just met him that night, but said he seemed angry with her. He carried a knife and wore camo clothing. She had said if any one of those boys had killed her mom, it was him. Michael Green had never been talked to, but he agreed to talk now even though he was in custody and had been read his Miranda warnings. Michael Green told Gaines and Ramsey that on the night of the murder, he'd been hanging out with Stephen G., Kelvin, and a girl he'd just met named Autumn. He admitted that he carried a buck knife. When they asked him whether he'd committed the murder of Jane Hylton, his response was, "I'd like to say no." He continued to deny being at Jane's house and having any idea how his DNA might have gotten on her body. District Attorney Investigator Gaines told Green that his mother had called the station asking why her son had been arrested. Gaines told Green that it was up to him to tell his mother the details of the allegations against him. At this point, Green blurted, "I fucked up in the past," and he started talking about his son and said, "I fucked up in the past and I guess now it's going to fuck him up, but he's a strong kid and I'm pretty sure he'll power through it." Neither Kelvin B. nor Stephen G. had ever been talked to either. Kelvin was dead, but Stephen G. wasn't. The next day, El Dorado investigators paid Stephen G. a visit. They knocked on his door and said, "We're from El Dorado County Sheriff's Office, and we're investigating a murder," and Stephen said, "Yes, I know all about it." What? Stephen now told the investigators everything he knew, all of which he had known since the night of July 6th to 7th, 1985. That night, Michael Green was in town visiting his buddy Kelvin Beckham, who had recently moved from Roseville to El Dorado Hills. They had gone to high school in Roseville together. Green was in town because Kelvin's brother was having a keg party and the teens were doing their teen thing. Stephen remembered that Green was carrying a knife that night. He showed it to them. Stephen said that evening he, Kelvin, and Green stole a mini keg of beer from the party and went to the park. There they met Autumn. Later that night they all attended the party and hung out and smoked pot, and Kelvin and Autumn went off together. Then he and Green got separated from each other. At some point, he went home to Kelvin's house and fell asleep in Kelvin's room, where Kelvin was already snoring. He was surprised that Michael wasn't there, considering Stephen and Kelvin were his only two friends in town. During the night, he woke up, and Michael was there covered in blood. Stephen freaked out and said, "What happened to you?" And Michael said something to the effect of, "I sacrificed a rabbit to Cthulhu." Cthulhu is a character in a book by H.P. Lovecraft. Stephen saw that Michael was uninjured and went back to sleep. The next day, when Stephen woke up, Michael Green was washing his clothes out in a kiddie pool in the backyard, and the water was all red. What were these clothes? Camouflage pants. Remember that this was a detail that Autumn had given the 1985 investigators about Michael Green. Oh, and that he carried a knife. Stephen G. told the investigators that he had spent the past 35 years afraid of Michael Green. He and Kelvin had confronted Green about the slaying. When news of the murder hit the media, Kelvin and Stephen said, "Did you do this?" Green finally admitted, somewhat pridefully, that it was him who killed Jane Hylton. Stephen said that Green was excited and not remorseful. He had gone to the house to find Autumn and was confronted by her mother. He talked about how she just wouldn't die and how he finally kicked her jaw off. Remember that a large piece of flesh from Jane's chin was found in another bedroom. He even told them that he had broken off the tip of his knife in her head, something he would never have known if he weren't there. This confession happened within days of the murders, and Stephen was scared of what Michael Green could do and might have not have told investigators had they come and talked to him, but they never did. Stephen G. was never interviewed until 2020. If he had been interviewed back in 1985, perhaps he would have gotten the guts to come clean with the investigators about what he knew. Ricky Davis never would have been convicted and would not have spent 15 years of his life in prison. 2020 investigators showed Autumn some photos of Michael Green. She confirmed that this was the Michael Green who was with her on the night of her mom's murder, the one whom she had told investigators all about back in 1985. So, when Michael Green was arrested on February 11, 2020, the murder charge was filed against him in juvenile court. I know, the dude was 51 years old, but he was a minor, age 17, when he allegedly killed Jane Hylton, so the charges had to be filed in juvenile court. He was booked into the El Dorado County Jail to await legal proceedings with no bail, and the prosecution immediately filed a motion to have him transferred to adult criminal court. Green and his attorneys fought this transfer tooth and nail. The scene in court at the transfer hearing was a very strange picture. It's rare that someone's arrested after more than a quarter century for a crime they committed as a youth. Green was not only a grown man, but was 51 years old, and he looked like he was old beyond his years, with a grizzled gray beard, squinty eyes, hunched posture, and dreadlocks down to his waist. Just as if he were a juvenile, multiple family members were there to support him, as his attorneys fought to keep his case in the juvenile system. The upside to this was that if convicted of the murder, he would be subject only to those penalties that youths would face, and Green would be handled by the California Department of Social Services, or DSS. It meant no adult prison. It seems ridiculous, but the El Dorado DA's office had to present valid reasons why the 51-year-old should be prosecuted as an adult. This was all argued out in a multi-week-long transfer hearing. The prosecution argued that at the time of the crime, Michael Green was on the verge of 18, this was a vicious thrill kill, and a man in his 50s does not belong under the purview of DSS. Thankfully, the judge agreed. Green's case was assigned to El Dorado County's Superior Court in South Lake Tahoe. Green's attorney mounted a vigorous defense initially. One of the first things they did was challenge the forensic genealogy, filing a motion to compel production of discovery seeking access to information about the technique by which Green had initially been identified. As we know, no one is arrested on the basis of a forensic genealogy identification. Green was arrested only after the STR DNA profile in his household garbage matched that of the killer of Jane Hylton. But his attorney wanted to review all the documents, information, and materials relating to the genealogy. The state opposed the production of these materials because forensic genealogy was literally irrelevant now that Green's STR profile had been determined to be a match. This next bit is all taken from legal documents in the Brian Kohberger case, which cited the judge's decision in the Green case as non-binding precedent. Quote, Green argued he was entitled to the genetic genealogy information, including the family tree. Green asserted the information was necessary to ascertain the following: details of what, when, where, and how the investigation into him occurred, the identity of other possible DNA matches that surfaced, so these individuals could be interviewed, since such evidence could be exculpatory if their DNA matched the DNA on the nightgown, and possible violations of the Fourth Amendment. The trial court held that the prosecution was not, quote, obligated to discover to Green the requested match detail reports, long-form candidate match reports, family tree information, lists of people identified through the forensic genetic genealogy investigation as being related by DNA to Green, or any other information from its forensic genetic genealogy investigation, end quote. The court reasoned, quote, the evidence that is material to Green's guilt or innocence is the testing that followed the forensic genetic genealogy investigation, which directly compared a fresh swab of Green's DNA with the DNA profile collected from the victim's nightgown. It is only this evidence that the people intend to present at trial. The people are not obligated to provide its preliminary search of the genealogy databases for possible matches, which is investigatory in nature and is not exculpatory or material to Green's defense. Green has presented no evidence as part of his motion or supplemental filings that tend to show that the persons identified through GEDmatch who shared DNA with Green can otherwise be linked to the crime he's accused of committing. A mere possibility that the information might help the defense does not establish that this evidence is material, end quote. Boom. The judge ruled the detailed forensic genealogy information was not discoverable. In a multi-week preliminary hearing, the state had to present evidence to the court showing why they had probable cause to try Michael Green for Jane Hylton's murder. Of course, Green could be expected to argue that they did not have sufficient evidence to find that it was more likely than not that he was guilty, the standard at the hearing. But I was stunned to learn that Green's defense was not, "I didn't do it," but was, "I was acting in self-defense." Here was Michael Green's story. He was visiting Kelvin Beckham for the weekend from his hometown of Roseville, which was about 15 miles away. The three teens, Michael Green, Kelvin, and Stephen G., met Autumn at the park that evening. Then later that night, they met up with her to go to a party. Over the course of the evening, Green and Stephen G. got separated from Autumn and Kelvin, who went off on their own. Somehow, Michael and Stephen got separated, and Michael made his way to Autumn's house. Now, there's conflicting testimony about when exactly Green learned where Autumn lived. It's unclear whether they had picked Autumn up there for the party, or walked her home earlier, or she pointed it out, or what. We know he at least had passed by or been to the house once that night and knew where it was. So now he was alone. Green said he went to the house looking for his friends. He said the door was open, and he walked in calling, "Hello, anyone here?" A voice yelled, "Up here." He went upstairs, and he saw Jane at the top of the stairs. Startled, she attacked him, and he just tried to get away. Exactly 0% of people are buying this story right now. But to continue, the fight spilled into the master bedroom. They struggled. Green was on the floor. Jane tried to hit him with a lamp, and his folding knife fell out of his pocket, so he grabbed it and stabbed her in self-defense. Running back to Kelvin's house, he ditched the knife in a garbage bin a few doors down where it was never found. Well, the judge found there was probable cause to bind Michael Green over for trial. As the march toward trial proceeded, the El Dorado County District Attorney's Office and Green's attorney, Margaret Huscher, worked out a plea deal. Instead of first-degree murder, which was what Green was initially charged with, in July 2022, Michael Green agreed to plead no contest to second-degree murder before Judge Suzanne Kingsbury. There would be no trial. Green was brought into the courtroom in his prison garb and shackles, which were removed. Judge Kingsbury asked him a series of questions about whether he understood his rights and was waiving his right to trial, and so on. He quietly answered yes and entered his formal plea of guilty to second-degree murder or wrongful killing without premeditation. The next step was the sentencing. Green's sentence was not negotiated as part of the plea agreement. Each side would argue their case to the judge as to the severity or leniency of the sentence based on the laws in effect in 1985. And Michael Green and his attorney took the position of, he did not deserve any prison time at all. Yep, you heard me right. Green's position was not, "I'm innocent." He had already copped a plea. His position was, "I did that when I was a kid. Now I'm a fully reformed adult who has been a law-abiding member of society for 35 plus years. I present no danger to the public, so imprisoning me would be useless and pointless." Well, it's true that Green had no record. All he had was a DUI. But seeking just probation for a murder in which he stabbed a woman 29 times, this guy was living in La La Land. That's not how this works. The Assistant District Attorney Jay Linden pointed out that Green's reformation clearly didn't involve coming forward to avoid an innocent man take the fall for his own horrific acts. Green claimed not to know about Ricky being tried and convicted, even though he lived in the area his whole life and it was big news. And he didn't really express remorse. It was more, "I've changed." Let's talk about the sentencing hearing held on September 27, 2022. This is an excerpt from South Tahoe Now article about the hearing. Quote, "It was an emotional day in court as Jane Hylton's family shared their victims' statements. She left behind 6 children, 2 of whom were pregnant at the time, and would now have been a grandmother to 10 and great-grandmother to 9, end quote. And this from the Sierra Sun, quote, "Hylton's children stood one by one to describe the unforgivable loss that Green had inflicted on their family. The why it happened and how different my life could have been will haunt me forever," the second of the siblings to speak, Heather Purvis McConnell, said. "My mother can finally rest in peace. Let the healing begin." Ardith Brandon, Hylton's 4th child, said, "I love my mother, and I assume Michael loves his mother too." Instead of a statement about her experience, she chose to ask questions. "I want to know what he would feel or what he would say to the person who stabbed your mother 29 times. What would you do if you received an early morning call to tell you your mother is dead?" The court listened as she described gathering her mother's belongings from the house, seeing blood on the walls and ceiling, and walking through blood-soaked carpet. She finished with a powerful declaration, "We will always have something in common, regretting the stupid decision you made 37 years ago." Hylton's son Ian Purvis echoed his sister's experiences and pain. The family shares recurring nightmares exacerbated by this continuous uncertainty and the crooked finger of blame pointed at his sister Autumn. His statement was nearly inaudible through grief-stricken tears. "All the words we say will never bring my mother back." That all from the Sierra Sun. And that brings us to Autumn, the last sibling to deliver her victim's impact statement. Back to the South Tahoe Now article, quote, "Through what the current El Dorado County District Attorney Vern Pearson calls questionable interviewing techniques and investigation, Autumn was labeled a suspect, and law enforcement told her family she was responsible back in 1985, driving a wedge into a family already traumatized. Unable to find a place to live with family members, Autumn was placed into the foster care system. She told the court Tuesday that she felt abandoned by her family. When Davis was arrested, she went through those labels once again, only recently being able to try and reconnect with her siblings. Hylton's children are now in their 50s and 60s. "I spent 13 years of my life as an orphan in a large family," Autumn told the judge. "The nightmare we share just will not end," she said. She told Green, "You may have only killed one person, but you ruined numerous lives. We forever have holes in our hearts." Autumn described Green to the court as violent, vicious, and animalistic. She addressed him directly, saying angrily, "You sit very still and almost in a catatonic state. Isn't it ironic that the stillest person in the room is capable of the most violence?" Autumn made it clear that she was emotional not only because Michael Green murdered her mother, but because she had been railroaded by the original detectives. She said time and again they came back to her, trying to intimidate her into confessing that she'd had a hand in her mother's murder. She was not permitted properly to grieve her mother's death because she constantly had to defend herself against accusations from those who were supposed to be helping her. Green's defense attorney, Margaret Husher, tried to present mitigating circumstances to prove that her client was reformed. She brought in 5 people to testify who were friends of Green when the murder took place. All said he was friendly, an athlete, a little silly, jovial, the life of the party, and even loving. As reported by the Sierra Sun, all of the witnesses agreed they had been shocked to find their friend had inflicted any harm, let alone taken someone's life. Green's ex-wife and mother of his child, Karen, took the stand, telling the court she never saw Green violent, never angry. "There's just not a bad bone in Mike," she said. Margaret Husher didn't just rely on character evidence, though. She called Dr. Elizabeth Kaufman, a UC Irvine professor in psychological science education and an expert in adolescent brain development. This from the Sierra Sun, quote, "Dr. Kaufman's research claims the emotional and cognitive functions progress at varying speeds, and during late adolescence, between 15 to 18 years of age, there is a gap between the two." She further explained that while the late adolescent stage allows the individual to understand right from wrong, they are also functioning under diminished capacity for impulse control, end quote. In other words, teenagers sometimes act impulsively and do things before thinking them through. I think we can all agree this is true. They do dumb, risky stuff like drag racing on the highway or swallowing Tide Pods. They do not stab women 29 times on impulse. That's not a typical teen. That's a homicidal psychopath. After the defense had presented its case for lenience, ADA Jay Linden read a statement on behalf of Jane's family. Quote, "You beat her. She had numerous blunt force wounds about her head and face. By your own words, you kicked her jaw. You bit her on the shoulder. Why was that? Was she trying to get away from you? You took out your knife, opened your blade, and then you inflicted 29 sharp force wounds. She was stabbed in her head. She was stabbed in the neck, the front, and the back. She had defensive wounds on hands and arms and tried to keep you from murdering her. You didn't just kill Jane that night, but destroyed numerous other lives as well. Jane was 54 years old, and here you are the same age she was when you killed her," end quote. Here, ADA Linden asked Michael Green if he knew anything about the woman whose life he had taken on a whim. Quote, "She was from Canada, working on her real estate license, a journalist for El Dorado Hills. She wrote articles about social events. She had 6 children. She was a woman who would write poems for each of her children. Mary Jane, Sue Ann, Heather, Ardythe, Ian, and Autumn." It was time for closing arguments. Defense attorney Margaret Husher reiterated all the reasons we've heard why they believed Green should receive simple probation. Judge Kingsbury stepped in and shut that down right away, interjecting with, "The court is not going to put him on probation." ADA Linden closed with what everyone except Michael Green was thinking. Quote, "This application for probation is offensive. It is a smack to this family who has endured this for decades. In essence, you're saying he got away with murder for 37 years, so let's let him get away with it some more." It was Judge Kingsbury's turn to speak. She didn't mince words. She said, quote, "After 26 years on the bench, this stands out as the single most brutal crime that I can imagine, just based on the sheer number, quantity, and type of wounds Miss Hylton sustained. This woman fought and fought and fought and fought for her life. I have found that closure is a myth. Both sides will have to make their own closure. I hope that everyone is able to heal as best they can. I have no doubt that's what your mom would have wanted. I wish the family peace and a better life going forward." Judge Kingsbury also addressed Michael Green. She recommended to him that he try to make the most of the resources that would be at his disposal while in prison. She said, quote, "I've heard from your friends that there's a great side of you and you have much to offer. You're still young enough to come out and have a productive life." Green was not required to allocute. He had given ample statements about what he'd done to the DA's office investigators and had pleaded guilty. Judge Kingsbury sentenced Green to 15 to life. Because of the laws in effect in 1985, he will receive 1/3 conduct credit. He'll be eligible for parole in February 2029. Prosecutors don't believe that he'll be awarded parole at that time, but it still doesn't seem like enough, does it? Green entered prison at San Quentin on November 2nd, 2022. He could walk out after serving a mere 7 years, thanks to the 1/3 credit and credit for the 957 days he had served since his arrest. That's about 1 year in prison for every 3 stab wounds he inflicted on Jane Hylton, and it's less than the time that Ricky Davis served. That's not really justice, is it? So who is Michael Eric Green? Well, we really don't know much about him at all. It seems he led a quiet, under-the-radar life in Roseville, living on the same block his whole life. He grew up with parents Earl and Enge and a sister. He graduated from Oakmont High School in 1986. He worked a series of menial, odd jobs. He married and had a son. After his divorce from his wife, Karen, he moved in with his mom at her home off Rocky Ridge Drive. As we heard from his friends at the sentencing hearing, they thought Green was a great guy who would never hurt a fly. Neighbors and acquaintances felt the same way. A classmate of Green's from middle and high school told KCRA that, quote, "He's not that kind of person. He truly was a kind, easygoing person, even-tempered. Super chill, just an easy, laid-back kind of guy. I mean, he's lived in the same place in Roseville over by Maydew Park, and he's an easygoing guy. He's a dad." This all from CBS News. Neighbors say Green has spent much of his life in his parents' suburban Roseville home or living in a home next door, caring for his parents as they've grown old. Norm Bartlett says Green seemed to know everyone on the block. "Yeah, that's a shocker," Bartlett said. "He was talkative, that's all I can say. He seemed friendly. He's been on this block, I think he told me, since he was a kid. I think he said he was, quote, a lifer." Neighbor Alan Bartley called Green a regular guy. "I can imagine a person doing something as a teenager and saying, 'Oh my God, what did I do?' and burying it for the rest of his life. I mean, not very good to let somebody else go to jail for it," Bartley said. But these people only saw the side of Michael Green that he wanted them to see. His buddy, Stephen G., one of the 2 friends Green confessed to, testified at the sentencing hearing that over the years, Michael Green would menace him and Kelvin to keep them from ever revealing what he had done. During one argument, Green aggressively said, "You know what I'm capable of." This was when the 2 were long into adulthood. Stephen said he was afraid to try and drop him as a friend, so they stayed in touch over the years. And he was so paranoid about Green's homicidal tendencies, he kept a file in his computer, naming him, in case anything ever happened to him, Stephen. Hence, he was unsurprised when police showed up at his door asking about the murder of Jane Hylton. So why had the 1985 investigators not gone after the black kid named Michael Green who lived in Roseville, wore camo, and carried a knife, exactly as described by Autumn, instead of the white local kid who Autumn didn't connect to the crime, who denied any involvement, and who had zero physical evidence connecting him to the crime? Well, as we heard, the police hadn't bothered to track down this Michael Green. They had disbelieved Autumn and simply didn't do their job. It would have taken 5 minutes to contact the high school in Roseville and find student Michael Green, who was a junior at the time. Autumn gave them his full name, for God's sake. But they had set their sights on Ricky. From what I understand, Ricky and his family weren't typical El Dorado Hills residents. The town was upper middle class, with golf courses, large homes on lush green lawns, and well-off residents. But Ricky's mom, Maureen, was a single mom to 4 who worked as a waitress. They lived in the home her mother owned. Ricky grew marijuana in the backyard. It's possible the cops railroaded Ricky because he didn't really fit in and they didn't like him. They cherry-picked the evidence and, one could argue, manipulated it to make it fit the narrative they preferred. In conjunction with his announcement of the factual innocence of Ricky Green, DA Vern Pearson announced a new interrogation policy his office was implementing. His press release says in part, quote, "The primary evidence against Davis was the false confession of a co-defendant. That confession was obtained through the use of aggressive interrogation techniques, now known to be more likely to produce false confessions. In response, DA Pearson is now spearheading a nationwide campaign to change the way investigators interview suspects and witnesses. Pearson has issued a new policy for his office, which he hopes will become a standard among prosecutors. The El Dorado County District Attorney's Office will now limit the filing of criminal charges in any case where the primary evidence against the suspect consists of a confession obtained through the use of threats, deception, or psychologically manipulative interrogation tactics. False confessions result in the wrongful convictions of factually innocent individuals while allowing the actual perpetrator to evade justice, said Pearson. Investigators should use a rapport-based information-seeking approach because the science shows it's more effective. So you just heard District Attorney Pearson state that his new policy is designed to eliminate interrogation techniques that can lead to false confessions. El Dorado County was getting hit in the pocketbook for what happened to Ricky Davis. After his case was dismissed and he was told he was free, Judge Malikian thanked Ricky for his graciousness and apologized for the way too long a time he spent in prison. The judge informed him of his statutory right to seek compensation for the years of wrongful incarceration. And sure enough, in April 2020, Ricky was awarded a large sum of money in compensation from the state of California, amounting to $140 for every day he spent in custody. I'm not certain how much he actually received, but I've heard reports as high as $750,000. Then in August 2020, Ricky filed a lawsuit against El Dorado County in U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of California. This lawsuit, filed in federal court, alleges that Ricky's civil rights were violated by the County of El Dorado and its legal representatives, former detectives Bill Wilson, his estate, Rick Fitzgerald, Richard Strasser, Larry Hennick, and Dr. Robert Anthony. The complaint alleged that these state actors actually fabricated evidence and coerced Connie Dahl's confession implicating Ricky. In his complaint, Ricky cited all the things we've talked about: the failure to investigate witnesses, the strong-arm interrogation tactics, the tunnel vision, and, as alleged by Ricky, the actual fabrication of evidence, such as the revised medical examiner report and the recorded interview statement by Ricky relating to where he found Jane. As of this time, the judge had denied the defendant's motions to dismiss, basically saying that Ricky has a valid cause of action and the case is proceeding through pretrial motions and discovery. So Ricky got a large payout and has a lawsuit pending, but it seems that his years in prison may have permanently impacted him. According to local Placerville publication The Mountain Democrat, Ricky Davis was arrested in December 2022 on charges of felony assault with a deadly weapon, not a firearm, and a probation violation. Ironically, on paper, Michael Green looked like a model citizen next to Ricky Davis, who was a bank robber before he was unjustly convicted of murder. As I mentioned earlier, Green had no criminal record when he was arrested for murder. It's possible he's one of those killers who did it once on a whim and then never did it again. Because there's nothing on this guy. He wasn't a stalker or a peeping Tom or a flasher or a rapist, at least not that anyone knows of. Prosecutors believe that what Michael Green did to Jane Hylton was a thrill kill, and we know he almost bragged to his friends later about what he'd done. And although he enjoyed decades of freedom while someone else paid the price for his heinous crime, I like to think that he spent every second of that time looking over his shoulder for those blue and red police lights coming up behind him. After 35 years, the murder of Jane Hylton is solved thanks to forensic genealogy. And if you're one of the bad guys, they're coming for you. Recently, I let listeners know about a new benefit available to them called an AbJack Insider subscription that's available through Apple Podcasts. An AbJack Insider subscription will give listeners ad-free access to every bit of DNA ID content published, both past episodes and future episodes. It will also give you benefits like early access and bonus content. Head over to Apple Podcasts and click on the DNA ID show page or the AbJack Entertainment channel to start a free trial. Thanks for listening to this episode of DNA ID. If you'd like to listen to the show ad-free and help support the show in the process, please head over to patreon.com/DNAID. And if you're interested in some fun DNA ID merch, visit the store at customizedgirl.com/s/DNAID podcast. To contact the show, please email us at dnaidpodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on social media at DNAID Podcast on Instagram, at DNAID Podcast on Twitter, or on Facebook at facebook.com/DNAID Podcast. Finally, if you want to visit our website, go to DNAIDpodcast.com You'll be able to get all the episodes of the show, leave comments on episodes that I can respond to, and you can even leave voicemails. You'll get all the latest news about the show and important updates. Find links to our social media, merch, and a lot more. It's really your one-stop shop for everything DNA ID. DNA ID is written, researched, and hosted by me, Jessica Betancourt. It's produced by me and Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Music by Connor Betancourt. Check out our other collaborative podcasts, Scene of the Crime, Missing Persons, and Beyond Bizarre True Crime.